Manipulation and persuasion. What distinguishes legitimate persuasion from abusive manipulation? At first glance, both involve influencing another person to adopt a certain viewpoint or behavior. However, the crucial difference lies in how this influence is exercised and how free the other person remains to make their own decision. Persuasion, in its most honest form, relies on clear arguments, verifiable evidence, and a respect for the audience's autonomy. Manipulation, on the other hand, seeks to undermine or override that autonomy, often resorting to distortion, emotional coercion, or misinformation. Picture a spectrum that ranges from sincere, empathetic communication to the most pernicious form of manipulation. On the positive end, persuasion might look like an open dialogue where reasons are laid out, experiences are shared, and mutual understanding is sought. The listener retains their own judgment and can disagree at any point. On the negative end, you find abusive manipulation intended to control the other person's will, often without the victim even realizing it. This might employ tactics like deception, emotional blackmail, omitting key information, and psychological pressure. Advertising offers a clear example of this duality. An ad striving to persuade legitimately will present the benefits of a product. It will show real testimonials, detail advantages, and compare prices or quality in a transparent manner. Its goal might be to connect with the consumer emotionally, but without falsifying information. However, if a campaign exploits unfounded fears, if you don't buy this insurance, everything will go wrong, exaggerates claims or deceives about its qualities, it's resorting to manipulative methods that push the person until they lose the freedom to make a calm, well-informed decision. When we apply this analysis to personal relationships, the line becomes more blurred. In a romantic situation, for instance, someone might want to persuade their partner of a new plan or a change in habits. If they do so by presenting arguments, showing understanding, and allowing the other person to discuss it, they remain in the realm of legitimate persuasion. But if they use phrases like, "If you truly loved me, you'd do this," "Don't abandon me or you'll make me suffer," or if they even twist past events to make their partner feel guilty or confused, then they're infringing on that person's freedom of choice. This method undermines the other person's self-esteem and drives them to act out of fear or obligation rather than genuine conviction. In workplace settings, manipulation can take many forms. For example, a boss who wants the team to work overtime might, instead of making a straightforward request with fair reasons, rely on subtle pressure such as "everyone else does it" or excessive praise, followed by a veiled demand. "You're the most capable employee, I trust you to finish these reports tonight." The employee, afraid of disappointing the boss's expectations, feels almost forced to accept. This mechanism erodes the possibility of a genuine no and creates an environment where individuals gradually lose their ability to negotiate or set boundaries. Hence, autonomy is the fundamental yardstick. In persuasion, the person always retains the freedom to refuse or disagree without facing reprisals or undue guilt. In manipulation, doubt is planted, vulnerabilities are exploited, or certain strategies are deployed so that an individual acts contrary to their original will, often without fully realizing they've been steered in that direction. Manipulative tactics can be extremely subtle, selectively using information, intentional silences to create discomfort, reframing a situation. "If you don't do this, you'll cause great harm," and so on. A key question is how aware we are that we're being manipulated. People tend to believe they're too smart to fall for such tricks, but manipulators specifically rely on our confidence. They exploit the values or emotions that matter to us, compassion, loyalty, the desire for approval or belonging, so that when someone pushes those emotional buttons, we may end up behaving in ways we wouldn't choose if we were in a more rational, free state of mind. Plus, pride can lead us to deny that we've been manipulated, since admitting it means accepting that someone got further into our psyche than we'd like. Emotional advertising on social media is a modern example of this. Every time we see an ad that speaks directly to our insecurities or aspirations, possibly based on browsing data or purchase history, we can be tempted to believe that this product is precisely what we need. Real information is mixed with emotional exaggerations, and before we know it, the line between a genuine want and one that's been induced becomes blurred. We end up buying or wanting things that, objectively speaking, aren't truly necessary. To protect our independence of judgment, it's vital to cultivate critical thinking and develop the ability to question our initial reactions to certain proposals or messages. We might ask ourselves, am I making this decision based on clear, voluntary reasoning, or do I feel pressured or guilted? Or, which methods is this person using to get me on their side? Such self-examination serves as an early warning to ward off more aggressive forms of manipulation. Finally, it's worth noting that not all manipulation is driven by malicious intent. Sometimes people do it out of ignorance or fear of direct confrontation. However, once such behavior becomes habitual or is aimed at excessive control, it can lead to toxic, unbalanced relationships. In conclusion, legitimate persuasion is grounded in transparency, respect, and honesty, whereas manipulation thrives on deception and coercion. Learning to tell them apart is essential for maintaining healthy interpersonal relationships and exercising our autonomy consciously. The more adept we are at recognizing the early signs of manipulation, the better we can establish boundaries and protect our own interests without falling into the trap of anyone, knowingly or otherwise, trying to undermine our freedom. Gaslighting. Among the most subtle and damaging tactics within what's commonly called dark psychology, gaslighting stands out for its ability to completely undermine one's self-confidence. What exactly is it? It's a form of psychological manipulation in which the aggressor, by constantly denying facts, distorting reality, or systematically planting doubts, makes the victim question their own perceptions, memories, and even their sanity. The term originates from the play and subsequent film Gaslight, in which a husband makes small changes to the brightness of the gas lights in the house, but then denies these changes to his wife, insisting that she's imagining them. Through this, she comes to believe she's losing her mind. Although it may sound theatrical, this mechanism occurs with disturbing frequency in abusive relationships, toxic family environments, or authoritarian workplaces. Why is it so devastating? Unlike other forms of manipulation that may aim for a one-time decision, like making a purchase or conceding a specific argument, gaslighting targets the person's entire mental structure. If someone manages to make you doubt your memories, are you sure it happened that way? Or your emotions, you're overreacting, there's no reason to feel like that, you become vulnerable, questioning your own judgment and ceding more ground to the manipulator who convinces you that you're incapable of interpreting reality accurately. This phenomenon often appears in abusive relationships. For example, a partner systematically contradicts the other person's accounts, twists past conversations, "I never said that, you're making it up," or downplays legitimate reactions, "You're going crazy, there's no reason to cry." Gradually, the victim stops trusting themselves and, without a solid footing to anchor their perspective, may be forced to accept the abuser's version of events. Consequently, the abuser reinforces their control, while the victim, confused, no longer knows where reality ends and manipulation begins. Although gaslighting is frequently discussed in the context of romantic relationships, it's not the only setting where it occurs. Family dynamics can also foster it. Parents who dismiss a child's feelings. "You're not sad, you're just putting on a show." Siblings who constantly ridicule another's perceptions, or certain relatives who alter the story of past events to blame someone for incidents they didn't cause. Likewise, in cutthroat work environments, a supervisor or colleague might question a co-worker's memory or abilities. "Are you sure I didn't tell you that? I think your memory's failing." all to gain an advantage or discredit that person. What are the warning signs? First, a persistent feeling that you're mistaken or detached from reality, even regarding issues you were previously sure about. You may catch yourself constantly seeking validation from others because you can no longer rely solely on your memories or judgment. Additionally, the aggressor systematically denies verifiable facts, invalidates emotions, you're too sensitive, or justifies their stance with a condescending tone that makes the victim feel childish or hysterical. Another critical sign is isolation. As gaslighting progresses, the manipulator leads the victim to distrust friends and family, confining them in the microcosm the manipulator has created around them. To protect your mental health, it's essential to recognize these symptoms early on and break the cycle. It's not uncommon for victims to take months or years to realize what's happening, since gaslighting is typically implemented gradually. Hence the importance of heeding your intuition. If you feel you're living in a constant paradox where nothing ever quite adds up and you keep doubting yourself, it's a good idea to reach out to people you trust and talk about specific situations. Comparing facts with others can help reevaluate what you perceive and distinguish between what is genuine and what's been distorted. Moreover, seeking guidance from a professional, psychologist or therapist can be decisive in uncovering the manipulation and restoring confidence in your own judgment. The biggest challenge is that gaslighting is often linked to a deep emotional bond with the person carrying it out, whether partner, family member or boss, making it harder to recognize the pattern and to take steps to leave or set boundaries. However, realizing that someone systematically denies your reality or makes you feel unstable is the first step toward liberation. Recognizing that it isn't your mind failing, but rather a deliberate or even unconscious attempt to confuse your senses paves the way for reclaiming your autonomy. Ultimately, gaslighting is one of the most insidious techniques in dark psychology because it can unravel self-confidence and alienate a person from their own experience. Behind every act of gaslighting is the intention to have total control over how the victim interprets the world around them. Knowing these mechanisms and staying alert to them is vital for safeguarding mental health and breaking away from destructive relationships or environments. Narcissism and dark traits. The term narcissism is often used casually to describe anyone who is self-centered, but in psychology it denotes a deeper and sometimes pathological trait. What does genuine narcissism actually involve? It's characterized by an exaggerated sense of self-admiration, a profound belief in one's own greatness, and a constant need for praise and recognition from others. Unlike a healthy sense of self-love, which entails a balanced awareness of both strengths and weaknesses, narcissism is fueled by a distorted self-image in which the individual sees themselves as superior and demands that their environment confirm that superiority. This pattern is associated with behaviors of excessive entitlement, difficulty accepting criticism, and, crucially, lack of empathy toward the needs or feelings of others. For the narcissist, external validation becomes a kind of fuel that sustains their ego. When that validation isn't forthcoming, they tend to respond with anger, resentment, or manipulation, all in an effort to reaffirm their presumed status of superiority. Within the realm of dark psychology, narcissism is part of what's known as the dark triad, alongside Machiavellianism and psychopathy. These three traits often share a view of human relationships as instrumental, as well as a marked deficit in empathy, but each has distinct nuances. Narcissism centers on self-admiration, the need for applause, and the belief of constantly deserving preferential treatment. Machiavellianism emphasizes strategic manipulation and the notion that the ends justify the means, even if morally questionable. Psychopathy usually involves emotional coldness, difficulty experiencing remorse, and a certain impulsivity that can lead to risky or aggressive behaviors. How does narcissism manifest in everyday life? Someone with a strong narcissistic tendency can initially project an image that's highly appealing, full of charisma and apparent achievements. Over time, however, it becomes clear that they don't handle criticism well and require near-constant attention. In a work environment, for instance, a narcissistic boss might take full credit for the team's successes, while any failures are pinned on subordinates. They react poorly to any sign of disagreement, interpreting it as a personal attack. In personal relationships, this trait shows up starkly in romantic, family, or social circles. Early on, a narcissist may idealize the other person, showering them with attention to gain the admiration they crave. But as soon as things stop revolving around them, or that admiration wanes, they may become indifferent, manipulative, dismissive, or blame the other person for not meeting their demands for praise. In such situations, a narcissist doesn't just ignore the feelings of others, they become irritated if anyone expects genuine reciprocity. While people often confuse narcissism with high self-esteem, the essential difference is in the way one relates to others. A person with genuinely healthy self-esteem recognizes their worth without needing to belittle or exploit others as a supply for their ego. By contrast, the narcissist craves constant admiration and may respond with hostility if it's lacking. Additionally, healthy self-love doesn't reject constructive criticism. Instead, it sees it as an opportunity for growth. The narcissist, however, feels attacked by even the mildest feedback and can stir up conflicts to maintain an image of unassailability. Another key indicator is low tolerance for frustration. When circumstances don't favor the narcissist, or someone else receives praise, they may show disproportionate anger or resort to manipulation, ridiculing the other person's achievement, subtly discrediting them, or steering the conversation back to their own merits. This can cause teams or collaborations to falter, since the narcissist doesn't comprehend shared success or modesty. Their need to shine outweighs any concern for group goals or collective well-being. There are also different degrees of narcissism. Some individuals exhibit only mild traits. They like to boast and seek approval, but they don't necessarily dominate their relationships in a destructive way. Others meet the criteria for a narcissistic personality disorder, which severely affects their social adaptation and triggers ongoing conflicts. In many cases, the person doesn't reach a formal diagnosis, yet still demonstrates enough of these tendencies to make living or working with them difficult and stressful. In dealing with a narcissistic individual, it's not uncommon to encounter emotional manipulation, using guilt to get what they want, deflecting blame onto others, or demanding constant attention through dramatic pleas. "If you don't support me, you're betraying me." For those who live or work alongside them, recognizing these warning signs can help establish boundaries and avoid being drawn into the dynamics the narcissist imposes. Being able to refuse unreasonable demands and remind them that other people's needs and viewpoints also matter is crucial, though it may clash with their worldview of being the focal point. Studying narcissism within the framework of dark psychology also demonstrates how fragile the influence of praise or the pursuit of status can be when it isn't grounded in a realistic sense of self. Reflecting on narcissism not only helps us recognize it in others, but also encourages us to question how dependent we are on external approval or others' opinions. The challenge is to foster inner security that doesn't rely on continuous applause and to nurture relationships where respect and empathy take precedence over the desire for constant validation. Psychopathy and Machiavellianism. Within the study of dark personality traits, psychopathy and Machiavellianism occupy a prominent place due to the way both relate to manipulation, a lack of empathy, and viewing others as mere instruments. However, each trait focuses on slightly different aspects, and they can become particularly unsettling when they coincide in the same individual. Psychopathy, in its broader sense, isn't limited to the stereotypical image of a violent criminal or a serial killer. While extreme psychopathic cases have been dramatized in fiction, creating a popular notion of the term, the reality is that psychopathy encompasses a spectrum of traits such as emotional coldness, lack of remorse, and inability to empathize with others' suffering. Someone with high levels of psychopathy might function in society, maintaining a surface-level normality and even relationships that serve their personal goals. Often, these individuals are described as charming and capable of faking warmth or concern, at least for a while, if it benefits them. However, when circumstances turn against them, their indifference and inability to see things from another's perspective come to light. In the workplace, there's the notion of a corporate psychopath, someone who remains within legal bounds, yet displays behaviors that profoundly harm colleagues or subordinates. They can make decisions without considering the emotional toll on those affected, lying, manipulating, or firing people without hesitation if it helps them gain status or power. Their lack of guilt enables them to act with an understated aggression, sometimes subtle, unconstrained by moral barriers that would stop someone with stronger ethical convictions. This dynamic can undermine collective trust and create a climate of persistent tension and suspicion. On the other hand, Machiavellianism involves a conviction that the end justifies the means and a readiness to manipulate others to achieve personal advantage. The term, drawn from Renaissance thinker Niccolo Machiavelli, has been extended to describe individuals with a strategic view of relationships, in which every interaction is weighed in terms of potential benefits or drawbacks. Unlike the impulsivity sometimes present in psychopathy, the Machiavellian person operates more methodically, carefully plotting each step to secure a favorable outcome. They see other people as pieces on a chessboard, where information, alliances, and each person's weaknesses can and should be leveraged if it leads to personal gain. Emotional aspects aren't completely absent, but they're seen as factors to be calculated. If it's beneficial to appear friendly or empathetic, they'll do so. If it's more advantageous to show a sterner or more distant demeanor, they'll adopt that approach instead. Although popular culture tends to associate psychopathy or Machiavellianism with criminals and villains, not everyone with these traits crosses legal boundaries or engages in overt wrongdoing. Many operate in the realm of legality but create toxic environments in personal or professional settings. A boss who manipulates data, strategically spreads rumors, and pits colleagues against each other to maintain control might be a prime example of someone with Machiavellian tendencies. Similarly, a functional psychopath may climb the ranks in certain professional fields thanks to their lack of scruples and ability to feign amiability. These individuals can temporarily succeed in competitive structures, partly because their tactics go unnoticed or are even mistaken for determination and cleverness. However, over time, their relationships tend to unravel as others realize they're being used primarily for personal gain. The absence of remorse and the overriding focus on self-interest means they can sever ties or walk away from situations without emotional hesitancy whenever it suits them. Their lack of empathy prevents them from forming genuine bonds, and for those around them, recognizing the signs of calculated manipulation or indifference to suffering is essential for avoiding entrapment in their maneuvers. It's important to note that not all individuals with psychopathic or Machiavellian traits end up as criminals or obviously harmful. Some show these tendencies to a lesser degree without escalating to violence or systematic exploitation. For instance, someone might be relatively insensitive or extremely pragmatic in the workplace, but never commit illegal acts or overt cruelty. Still, even moderate degrees of such traits can create stressful or unproductive environments. As soon as someone's personal benefit consistently outranks ethical considerations, distrust and resentment take root among those who must interact with them. For those dealing with such individuals, it's crucial to identify the indicators of manipulation. Carefully scripted speeches, contradictions between words and actions, emotional detachment when discussing situations involving suffering, or an ability to shift attitudes without regret or emotional discomfort. When these patterns become evident, setting firm boundaries and avoiding unnecessary disclosure of personal information can serve as a protective measure. Moreover, emotional resilience and support from others in the group, work environment, or from close friends, personal life, are key to confronting and countering the control tactics employed by those who combine Machiavellianism with psychopathic traits. Being aware of psychopathy and Machiavellianism helps us understand how some individuals operate outside the moral and emotional considerations that most of us take for granted in social interactions. Their extreme pragmatism, lack of remorse, and inclination toward deceit make them potentially harmful, though not necessarily criminal. Recognizing such profiles is vital for avoiding dynamics ruled by manipulation and callousness, which exact a heavy toll in terms of stress, conflict, and emotional strain on all those involved. Cognitive biases and mind traps. The human brain, despite its remarkable capacity to process information, isn't free of mental shortcuts and systematic distortions that can lead us to errors in judgment. These shortcuts, known as cognitive biases, arise because we need to quickly handle the enormous amount of stimuli we perceive every day. However, they also make us vulnerable to manipulation tactics that exploit these weaknesses. Many strategies within so-called dark psychology rely on taking advantage of these biases to guide our decisions or perceptions without our even realizing it. One of the best-known biases is confirmation bias, which prompts us to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs. How does this translate into manipulation? Take advertising, for instance. It provides data aligned with the idea that a particular product is the best option for someone who already has a certain inclination or perceived need. If only the evidence that matches our expectations is shown, we're less likely to question the narrative being sold to us. Likewise, in interpersonal relationships, a manipulator may highlight only the facts that confirm another person's incompetence or guilt, reinforcing the notion that they should yield to the manipulator's wishes. Another well-known phenomenon is the halo effect, where a positive or negative impression of a single attribute of a person or product is generalized to all its other qualities. Consider a political speech. If the speaker has a commanding presence, a pleasant voice, and a handful of notable accomplishments, we tend to extend that favorable impression to all their proposals without applying the same rigor in evaluating them. This also happens in marketing when a celebrity with a good public image is chosen to advertise a product, letting their fame and charm rub off on the item's attributes, even when there's no actual connection between the two. In marketing, there are also strategies such as social proof, showing that everyone is buying or endorsing something, exacerbating our fear of being left out and taking advantage of our conformity bias. Seeing positive reviews or high sales numbers may spur us to make an impulsive purchase, thinking if so many people use it, it must be good. While this can be honest, it can also be manipulated with skewed or fabricated data. In political discourse, emotional appeal and the repetition of simplified slogans come into play. The brain looks for coherence and often accepts information that matches its feelings without much critical analysis. For instance, appealing to a sense of belonging, us versus them, can strengthen loyalty while concealing the complexity of the facts or the lack of solid arguments. In human relationships, someone with manipulative intentions can exploit anchoring bias, offering an extremely high or low initial figure in a negotiation so that the final agreement lands in their favor. Or they might use authority bias to gain trust, presenting themselves as an expert so that people accept their opinions without question. These traps aren't necessarily criminal but can skew free will and distort the way we evaluate reality. Being aware of these biases becomes a form of self-protection. It doesn't mean dismissing all data or proposals out of complete distrust, but rather recognizing that our brain tends to favor coherent narratives, minimize dissonance, follow the majority, or defer to an authority figure. Practicing critical thinking means asking questions like, what data might I be ignoring because it doesn't fit my initial view? Do I like this person or project for truly objective reasons, or is the halo effect at play? Am I applying the same standards of evaluation to those I admire and those I don't? Consistently posing these internal questions helps us cut off attempts by those who seek to exploit our cognitive tendencies for manipulation. Beyond marketing and politics, biases are part of everyday life. In a simple exchange with a friend or family member, we might dismiss their argument because we remember a past mistake, confirmation bias, or overvalue it if we find them particularly charismatic, halo effect. This underscores the importance of developing self-awareness, understanding that, no matter how rational we consider ourselves, we're exposed to systematic distortions that render us susceptible to malicious persuasion tactics. Ultimately, understanding cognitive biases and mind traps not only helps us thwart manipulation from others, but also pushes us to reflect on our own decisions and worldview. Exercising reasonable doubt, comparing different sources of information, and observing how we react to certain stimuli allows us to live more freely and consciously, reducing the likelihood of getting caught in webs woven by the subtle mental shortcuts we all possess. Limits between persuasion and control. In our daily lives, it's common to convince others of something. Maybe we want a friend to adopt a healthier habit, a family member to support a certain decision, or a co-worker to back a proposal. As long as it's done with respect, transparent arguments, and a genuine possibility for the other person to decline, we're talking about legitimate persuasion. There's an exchange of viewpoints, and each party retains the autonomy to have the final say. The problem arises when the process involves distorting reality, subjecting the other person to intense emotional pressure, or undermining their critical judgment to the point that they can't refuse or even realize they're being manipulated. To illustrate the difference, consider a scenario where friends are discussing potential travel destinations. In legitimate persuasion, the person proposing a location might provide facts about places of interest, costs, or safety. They can express enthusiasm but ultimately allow the other person to evaluate the pros and cons. Even if the proposer is very convinced of their idea, they accept the possibility that consensus might not be reached. Conversely, if they resort to statements like, "If you don't come with me, you were never a real friend," or "I'll be so upset if you don't join," it crosses into manipulation. Instead of presenting objective reasons, it uses emotional blackmail and guilt. Some forms of manipulation are considered subtle because they hide behind an appearance of closeness or even victimhood. Emotional blackmail uses emotional ties to coerce someone without seeming like an overt imposition. For instance, "If you truly loved me, you'd do this for me," appeals to love, friendship, or loyalty to corner the other person. It's not about asking them to reflect or weigh pros and cons, but rather imposing an emotional burden that makes them feel guilty if they refuse. In many cases, victimization is added, "See how I'm suffering, everything depends on you," so the target of manipulation feels responsible for the manipulator's happiness or emotional stability and ends up giving in almost without questioning. One of the most complex elements is when these forms of manipulation become normalized in certain relationships. You might see families where, out of tradition, one member resorts to dramatics or veiled threats to gain obedience. Comments like, "How can you do this to me after all I've sacrificed?" come to be seen as just that person's character, without questioning their toxic implications. In romantic relationships, it's not unusual to hear someone say, "Well, that's just how she is. They like to have their way," thereby accepting a dynamic of disguised domination. This blurred line grows more dangerous when the manipulator claims to act for the other person's good. For example, they might say, I'm forcing you to do this because I want what's best for you, manipulating with promises of some future benefit the victim didn't even request. They might also create a moral dilemma. If you don't do this, it means you don't care about me, turning the single requested action into a test of loyalty, making the victim feel they'd be a bad person if they refuse. Over time, the coerced individual comes to believe that rejecting the request would break the emotional bond or define them as cruel. In the workplace, these behaviors also appear covertly. A boss who convinces an employee to take on extra work by threatening their sense of job security. Think about your future here. You wouldn't want to disappoint management. Or using guilt. If you don't do it, the team will suffer and it'll be your fault. Has shifted from cooperative persuasion to manipulation, where the employee's autonomy is overshadowed by fear. Similarly, a colleague might adopt a victim stance so that others constantly rescue them from their own responsibilities, shaping a false narrative of helplessness to receive preferential treatment. Questioning what's accepted as normal involves carefully reviewing our relationships and asking, do I feel I can disagree without fearing emotional reprisals or outright rejection? Am I giving in just to avoid the distress the other person is putting on me, rather than because I genuinely think it's right? Am I hearing real arguments or just complaints and covert threats? Such questions provide a protective barrier against control. It's not about rejecting empathy or emotions, they're a key part of interacting, but about preventing empathy from becoming a weapon someone uses to overpower our will. A healthy communication aims to let opinions flow freely, finding agreements where both sides feel heard and preserve their dignity. If, again and again, discussions end with one single vision being imposed, our reasoning ignored, or our being forced to give in through threats or guilt, we're probably facing control rather than genuine persuasion. Noticing this boundary isn't always easy, especially if a relationship is deeply intertwined with strong emotional bonds or a long history, but it's vital for safeguarding emotional health and avoiding abusive patterns. It helps to see legitimate persuasion as a process in which people present arguments, acknowledge feelings, and respect the other person's final choice, without resorting to coercion or deception. Manipulative control, on the other hand, means imposing a single outcome, often cloaked in extreme emotions or moral high ground claims. Simply reflecting on this distinction, pausing to check if there's genuine room for a no in our relationships, is already an important step toward escaping manipulation patterns that undermine our freedom of choice. Experimentation and history of dark psychology. Throughout history, various experiments have shown how easily people considered normal can become involved in extreme or morally contradictory behaviors. Two emblematic examples are the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment, which have shed light on human susceptibility to obedience and the manipulative power of authority or context. Stanley Milgram's study in the 1960s set out to examine the extent to which a person would obey an authority figure, even when following orders contradicted their moral values. Participants were asked to administer increasingly intense electric shocks to an individual, in reality an accomplice feigning pain, all at the instruction of an experimenter who assured them of the study's validity. A strikingly high percentage of participants continued to deliver potentially dangerous shocks, despite hearing the victim's pleas and cries. They justified their behavior by believing they were simply following orders, or that they weren't personally responsible, demonstrating the strong influence that authority and the study's structure could have over their moral judgment. This work highlighted how vulnerable we are to hierarchical pressure and how a crafted situation can overshadow our empathy and critical reasoning. Meanwhile, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment in 1971 showed how power dynamics and assigned social roles can lead to abusive actions. Zimbardo assigned guard and prisoner roles to volunteer students within a simulated prison environment. In just a few days, many of the guards began exercising their authority in authoritarian and, in some cases, sadistic ways, while prisoners showed submission, stress, and emotional withdrawal. Although the study was stopped earlier than planned due to the rapid escalation of mistreatment, the lesson was clear. Power structures and assigned roles can drive ordinary individuals who ordinarily wouldn't act violently to engage in humiliation and abuse. Merely wearing a uniform or being given a position of authority was enough to provoke harmful behavior, reinforcing the notion that harmful actions don't always stem from individual traits, but from a context that validates or even encourages them. The importance of these experiments lies in revealing that, under certain circumstances, even people with no history of cruelty or sadism may be swayed toward blind obedience or harmful acts. This connects closely to the logic behind dark psychology. It's not only about some individuals having manipulative or cold traits. It's also that in certain environments, anyone can be persuaded or pressured into behavior they never would have imagined. While Milgram and Zimbardo concentrated on authority and power dynamics, their findings have been interpreted in fields like advertising, politics, and even personal relationships, where roles and group expectations profoundly affect behavior. Being aware of these factors is critical to avoiding extremes. No society is immune to the rise of charismatic leaders or systems that promote irrational obedience. And no one is completely safe from roles that, by offering a certain measure of power, can compromise our ethical standards. Moreover, assuming others are the only susceptible ones is a mistake. These experiments precisely show that ordinary people can succumb to situational pressure or strategic manipulation. On a more personal level, reflecting on such studies helps us recognize when an environment or authority figure is pushing us toward actions that clash with our values, so we can respond in time. We may not find ourselves in scenarios as extreme as administering electric shocks or guarding pretend prisoners in everyday life, but the lessons of Milgram and Zimbardo warn us that certain atmospheres can encourage manipulation and blind obedience in workplaces, families, or social circles. If a boss fosters a fiercely competitive climate and rewards aggressive behaviors, or if a group normalizes hateful rhetoric, even those who oppose such practices in theory can end up taking part or remaining silent. That's at the core of many collective behaviors people later regret. Recognizing these insights equips us with an inner alarm that helps us question the dynamics we get pulled into and fosters empathy and critical thinking when someone, uniformed or not, asks us to cross the boundaries of what we believe to be fair or humane. Recognizing and confronting manipulation. Figuring out that someone is exerting an excessive or misleading influence on us can be hard, especially if we trust that person or find ourselves in an environment where their attitudes are normalized. Even so, there are telltale signs that indicate the presence of manipulation and, likewise, methods to safeguard our autonomy. The first step is to recognize that manipulation can come in many forms, from explicit, aggressive demands to seemingly compassionate emotional maneuvers aimed at undermining our will. One frequent clue that manipulation is taking place is sudden changes in the manipulator's narrative or reasoning. For instance, one moment the individual might insist that we do something for our own good, and then immediately switch to accusing us of selfishness if we don't comply. This kind of duality and inconsistency causes the victim to feel there's no fixed point to the discussion where they can present counter-arguments or express their reasons. Furthermore, when the manipulator fails to achieve their goal, they might shift from a friendly, rational tone to one filled with anger or victimhood. It's common to hear phrases like, "I thought you cared, but clearly you don't," or "If you won't help me now, don't ever ask me for anything again." Through statements like these, They introduce emotional blackmail and progressively narrow the space for genuine debate. Another key aspect is identifying excessive pressure to decide on the spot, leaving no time to think or consult someone trustworthy. Urgency is a control tactic. If we're unable to pause and evaluate the proposal rationally or look at other options, we tend to act impulsively just to avoid conflict. A classic example is a once-in-a-lifetime sale or promotion that aims to stop the customer from comparing prices or consulting others, instead pushing them to cave quickly under the salesperson's pushiness. In personal relationships, someone demanding an immediate response and responding with anger when we request more time is essentially cutting down our ability to choose freely. A third frequent warning sign is constant guilt tripping. The manipulator tries to persuade us that by not complying with their desires, we'll cause irreparable harm or ruin the relationship. Phrases like, "If you don't do this, I'll be so disappointed in you," or "You're the reason everything's going wrong," are used to instill a sense of responsibility completely unrelated to the actual issue. The victim winds up taking on emotional burdens that aren't theirs and ultimately gives in, not because they're genuinely convinced, but to dodge the guilt thrust upon them. Assertive communication is an essential defense mechanism here. Being assertive means clearly and respectfully expressing how we feel and what we think, setting firm boundaries when we detect a violation of our autonomy. For example, if someone is insisting we do something and turning to guilt tripping, we can say, "I understand what you want, but my priorities are different right now. I appreciate your concern, yet I need you to respect my decision." In this way, we aren't insulting them or escalating the situation, but rather making it plain that we've considered their arguments and still have the right to take a different path. Assertiveness avoids both passiveness, where we yield without objection, and aggressiveness, where we might damage the relationship unnecessarily. Support from others can also be crucial, especially if the manipulation has been going on for a while or has deeply rooted itself in the relationship. Consulting friends, family, or trusted co-workers can give us an outside perspective, confirming or refuting the distortions the manipulator tries to impose. Sometimes, manipulators isolate their victims so they won't get feedback from other people who might reveal the abnormal nature of their interactions. By escaping that isolation and telling someone trustworthy what's happening, we can anchor ourselves in reality and see things more objectively. In cases where emotional abuse intensifies, such as systematic humiliation, ongoing gaslighting that undermines self-confidence, or a severe emotional dependence where disagreement is impossible without facing threats of abandonment, professional help might become necessary. A psychologist or therapist who specializes in toxic relationships and codependency can provide specific strategies for breaking the thought patterns that uphold manipulation. Through therapy, the victim learns to recognize these patterns, rebuild their self-esteem, and make changes to free themselves from oppressive influence. Should the manipulator be someone close, a partner or family member? A specialist might also suggest family therapy or interventions if the perpetrator is willing to admit the problem and work to change. Change in these dynamics doesn't happen overnight. Often the victim has been caught in a manipulation cycle that gradually wears down their self-confidence. Spotting the signals, insisting on taking the time we need to think, and leaning on trusted individuals around us are fundamental steps toward defending our integrity. Where manipulation has become deeply ingrained, intervention from a mental health professional can be decisive, helping the person restore their judgment and choose with clarity instead of fear, guilt, or warped narratives. This process takes perseverance, but with the necessary resolve and the right support, it's possible to regain freedom of choice and avoid staying in toxic relationships or environments any longer than necessary. Ethical reflection and self-awareness. How far can we claim that everyone, to some degree, uses certain forms of control or manipulation in daily relationships? This question can feel uncomfortable, especially if we've experienced being victims in situations of emotional abuse or blackmail. Nevertheless, asking it is crucial for realizing that dark psychology is not the sole domain of a few individuals with strongly negative traits. On a subtler level, any of us might employ manipulative tactics when we're afraid of loss, intensely desire something, or don't know how else to cope with our insecurities. One common example appears in family dynamics. Statements like, "How could you do this after everything I've done for you?" Or, "If you don't meet my expectations, I'll be extremely disappointed in you," can become part of everyday home life. Although these remarks might not seem aggressively confrontational, they contain an element of emotional blackmail that puts pressure on another person's will. Similarly, romantic relationships can exhibit covert tactics to sway a partner toward a plan or change. Individuals may rely on sentimental reproaches or a victim persona instead of open, constructive dialogue. These practices, which we sometimes accept as normal, in fact reflect a desire for control. Recognizing that doesn't automatically brand everyone as a chronic manipulator, but rather underscores how easily we might cross from genuine influence into more manipulative behavior, especially under stress or fear of rejection. As we learn how manipulation works, the need to act responsibly and ethically arises. Understanding cognitive biases, emotional vulnerabilities, or pressure tactics isn't inherently bad. The problem arises when this knowledge is used to coerce others into doing something against their will, through deceit, guilt, or veiled threats. The power that comes from understanding the human mind can become harmful if its objective is to subjugate another's autonomy. Even when there's no intent to harm, we can fall into patterns that gradually erode the self-esteem of those around us. Therefore, ethical reflection means pausing before making a strategically hurtful comment, or before methodically planning to force someone to do something they genuinely don't want to do. One factor that encourages a constructive use of these insights is empathy. Being empathetic means genuinely considering another person's feelings and needs. Combined with empathy, any attempt at persuasion will respect the other individual's boundaries and allow them to choose freely. It won't be about winning a dispute at someone else's emotional expense. Rather, it will involve exchanging viewpoints and ultimately letting them decide on their own. Without empathy, the temptation arises to see others as objects we can move around to our advantage, and that's when the understanding of dark psychology transitions into a tool for coercion and deceit. Responsibility is another vital foundation. Assuming responsibility means owning the consequences of our actions and the methods we use to achieve our goals. If we notice we're taking advantage of a friend's emotions or warping their perception of reality just to fulfill our own wishes, it's worth asking whether that outcome is worth the damage done to the relationship or the other person's well-being. Responsibility also includes the ability to set limits on ourselves. Where is the line for acceptable persuasion? When do we encroach on the other person's right to refuse? And if we see someone else being manipulated, how can we step in without causing further harm? Such questions may not have straightforward answers, but posing them keeps us from adopting a stance that any means necessary is justified to get what we want. Moreover, if manipulation stems from ingrained patterns, for example, growing up in an environment where emotional blackmail was the norm, self-awareness becomes indispensable. We might resort to certain tactics simply because it's the only way we learn to communicate, or because we're terrified of rejection if we don't exert control. Examining our own motivations can be a giant step toward cultivating more open, respectful relationships. And committing to ethical responsibility means that once we notice ourselves employing manipulative tactics, we try to correct course, perhaps by apologizing and promising to state our needs honestly going forward. Exploring these subjects helps us see that dark psychology is not merely a way to blame others or identify ourselves solely as victims. Rather, it's a lens through which to understand the complexity of human relationships. The drive for control or the need to feel secure can lead to behaviors that, in their mild form, might look harmless, but at a more intense level can border on abuse. Developing a higher degree of self-observation and awareness stops us from magnifying our own manipulative tendencies, and at the same time encourages us to be more compassionate about those who act harmfully out of fear or ignorance without excusing their actions. In this process, combining empathy, responsibility, and self-awareness fosters more balanced and free relationships where influence is not confused with imposition and persuasion does not become manipulation. Likewise, it gives us the ability to question effective methods some professional or personal spheres may endorse, regardless of their emotional costs. When we choose to ethically handle our knowledge of the mind, we help build an environment in which bonds are nourished by honesty and respect, minimizing the likelihood that the dark temptation to control others will become normalized in our lives. We've reached the end of this video after delving into how manipulation, gaslighting, narcissism, psychopathy, and cognitive biases can intertwine to create harmful relationships or environments. These concepts highlight the fragility of our human interactions when we're exposed to subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, influences that can undermine our autonomy and emotional well-being. Before we part ways, I encourage you to think about any settings in which you may have encountered these patterns. Have you experienced situations where someone distorts your reality, exercises excessive control, or exploits your insecurities? Recognizing these traits is the first step towards safeguarding your integrity and fostering healthier, manipulation-free connections. If you found this information helpful, I invite you to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments section. What stood out to you the most? Have you run into similar behaviors in your daily life? Your experiences and suggestions can enrich the discussion and shed light for others who are also seeking to understand these dynamics. I'm grateful for the time you spent watching until the end. Your presence and contributions help this community grow as we continue unraveling the mysteries of the human mind together. See you next time.